the course of just 5 decades, from the 1780s to the 1830s, the United States experienced an unprecedented period of growth. In this video, we'll trace the events that facilitated this rapid expansion of the Republic and show how economic and geographic pressures were in juxtaposition to the ideals established in the Declaration of Independence. We'll see how indigenous communities were removed from their ancestral lands to make way for agriculture and for access to resources. And we'll learn how innovations contributed to the wealth of the new country while driving demand for enslaved labor. The era of expansion truly began on July 13, 1787, with the enactment of the Northwest Ordinance. The ordinance set an important legal precedent. It gave the federal government power to expand west and paved the way for adding vast territories to the United States, fueling its growth over the next decades. The Northwest Ordinance bound the government to uphold the key values of the new republic as it expanded by granting inalienable rights to territorial citizens, with the exception of indigenous peoples. Crucially, the act did outlaw slavery in the territory, creating an economic distinction between northern and southern states, where slavery remained legal. It was this delineation that would later escalate tensions. The act also exacerbated issues of power between states and the federal government. Within the Constitutional Convention, there was much disagreement about the way forward for the nation's governance, with anti-federalists opposing the creation of one single nation. The new Constitution had failed to resolve all these underlying issues, but an agreement was finally made possible by the inclusion of new amendments and a Bill of Rights. The passing of this bill by the anti-federalists would be critical to the expanding republic. The 10th Amendment guaranteed states' rights, a principle of federalism, reserving all non-constitutional powers to the state. With this promise, the 13 colonies, now states, were given the confidence to join the Union. These amendments would further express the foundational ideals of the new republic as it sought to become a more perfect union. In 1803, under Thomas Jefferson's administration, the size of the country doubled with the historic purchase of the Louisiana Territory. The U.S. government set out to explore all its newly acquired land. The responsibility for the expedition was given to Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark. The land was far from uninhabited. Up to 100,000 people were living there, including indigenous peoples, enslaved and free black people, and white settlers, many of whom were French-speaking. The largest group were indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. Sacagawea, a Shoshone guide and interpreter, was critical to the success of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Working alongside other indigenous peoples, she helped with diplomatic relations, navigated uncharted terrain, and acted as a healer for the expedition. The maps created from the Lewis and Clark expedition were later to guide thousands of people on their journey west. This expansion would eventually spread democracy and capitalism across the continent, removing all perceived obstacles, including people, in the way. This was later termed Manifest Destiny. Inevitably, conflict between indigenous peoples and the settlers over land and resources escalated and turned violent. By 1812, the British were again, in part due to this expansion, at war with the United States. Many indigenous peoples decided to side with the British in the hope of halting further incursion into their ancestral lands. However, others took up arms on the side of the United States after being promised sovereignty. But hope of indigenous peoples' independence died when the powerful Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed at the Battle of the Thames. The War of 1812 ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which solidified U.S. independence and did nothing for indigenous peoples. Thoughts of indigenous sovereignty were not entertained, one of many years of broken promises. The U.S. government began to forcefully relocate tens of thousands of indigenous peoples onto federally controlled reservations. Officials believed this would reduce conflict. Their stated goal was to assimilate indigenous peoples, but the reality was a systematic effort to erase their culture and language by forcing them to speak English and adopt white traditions. As the country expanded geographically, so did the economy, kickstarting an economic revolution. Arguably, this success was in large part due to advances in technology. New waterways were charted, wagon trails created, helping to establish new towns and cities. But perhaps the most consequential innovation was the cotton gin. Designed to make cotton production more efficient, the cotton gin had the unintended consequence of increasing the need for both land and labor to help grow and pick more cotton. Cotton was so important that people at the time called it King Cotton, dominating the economy, but furthering the division between interests of the northern and southern states. The number of enslaved people in the U.S. in this period rose from around 900,000 by 1800 to almost 4 million by the next 60 years. Other inventions, like the steamboat, also facilitated the export of raw materials to mills in the northern states and to ports for trade. To attempt to reconcile this growing economic and geographical divide, the 1820 Missouri Compromise and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed both the new free and slave-owning states to join the Union on an equal footing. The declared values of liberty, democracy, and the pursuit of happiness, which had founded the new nation, had been put to one side again in the pursuit of economic success and political stability. For the enslaved and indigenous peoples, the declared values simply did not apply. The government's failure to address these inequalities was a critical factor in the outbreak of the Civil War and would lead to multiple movements for civil rights for all citizens of the United States that continue to this day.